Welcome into a new edition of BWI Live. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. Wednesday, December 18th, a historic day in the long established history of BWI Live, T. Frank. It's the first Wednesday show before a home Penn State college football playoff game. The Nittany Lions, of course, are marching on to Saturday's date with SMU. Kickoff set for noon Eastern time on TNT. T. Frank, Penn State has had 2 days of extensive media sessions and, of course, have been back on the practice field. We're going to get into that and also look ahead, I'm sure, a little bit to practice, which is tonight. And James Franklin will hold his final news conference of SMU week before Penn State, of course, takes its final chances to prepare for the Mustangs in the 11-6 matchup of the first round of the college football playoff. How are we doing this morning?
Doing all right. Kind of the same situation that Penn State probably feels it's in right now. Survive and advance to get through the holidays. Lots of stuff going on with everybody. So I'm always humbled and happy that people are here today to watch the show and to get some idea about what's going on with the Nittany Lions. I don't know how you feel about the last 2 days, Greg, but I'm exhausted. Normally our rhythm is James Franklin talks and then everyone else is on Zoom. Having everybody in person and having all of those comments and conversations, I feel like, it's great. We got a lot of quotes. Haven't had any time to write about them this week. How about you?
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I thought Rhett Lashlee, I can't remember which interview session it was in, but he was basically asked how him and his staff are handling everything that's going on right now. College football playoff preparations, 2024 roster management, 2025 roster management. Of course, we had the early signing day earlier this month, and he basically said right now, actually, it might have been one of their, I believe it was actually their offensive coordinator. But he essentially said right now, we're just in the weeds and we're just rolling with it. Pretty much what you just said. And he said, we'll look back on it in February and be just in awe of what took place. But for now, that's where the college football world is. And Penn State, of course, one of 4 teams hosting a round 1 playoff game and one of 8 playing this weekend. Go ahead.
I've got a folksy kind of, I don't even know the right word because I'm so frazzled. Like when I was a kid and I went to the barn, there was just one way through a mountain of crap, which was to just put your head down and shovel. And then eventually you look up and it's over. And that's what this time of year is. Like, don't look at what you're doing because you'll just want to throw your hands up and walk away. Just keep your head down and do monotonous, busy work until it's over. At least that's how it was when you were shoveling. That and the dawn of the MP3 player and the CD player was awesome. If I had wireless headphones when I was a kid, so much better. Like so much better than it was having the wired headphones that you had to snake through the back of your shirt, through your jacket, all the way down, clip it in, and then you had CD skipping. Oh no, like MP3 players, phones plus shoveling would be amazing.
Well, we are in that time now, but you are fortunately here with us on the BWI Live show, so none of that today. Let's get into some news of the week. So Drew Aller, as we covered earlier here on the YouTube channel, where we get your podcasts, and of course at bluewhiteillustrated.com, is coming back for the 2025 season. He was the only Penn State player who was discussing that on Monday, and I'm sure you guys covered it extensively on yesterday's BWI Live show. Tuesday, as we mentioned, brought with it a number of player interviews and also a number of guys who do not want to talk about what they intend to do in the future. Nick Singleton is one of them. Kobe King is one of them. A couple other guys as well. And basically at this point, nobody else is ready to make their stay or go decision. Zane Durant also among those conversations, Abdul Carter. And I'm not surprised by it at all. I think that once the Bo Prabula news came out, and I'll just be quick on this because it's rehashing what you guys I'm sure already talked about, but Drew Alvarez kind of had his hand forced. I mean, everyone sort of knew what was coming. None of these other guys have to wade into those waters quite yet.
Yeah, we didn't really cover that aspect of it. It was more of the impact of the decision and the kind of forward-looking thing. But you're absolutely right. It doesn't make any sense if Bo Prabula is going to enter the transfer portal to sit on the news that Drew Aller is coming back for 2025 because it's obvious. Like there's one reason Bo Prabula would be transferring. There was some talk and some conversation about, and this tends to happen of when concurrent news breaks later that day. Kyron Hudson commits. That fans were thinking, well, this is a selling point for receivers in the portal. I guess the only difference is, Greg, not everybody's going to find that out in terms of, but the guys you have conversations with absolutely will know the plan going forward. If, you're not going to hide that from them and be like, well, you know what? We're not sure about the quarterback situation. You're going to absolutely be selling that to every receiver you're interested in the portal. I don't think that they are linked, but I don't think that those things are absolutely the reason why Aller's decision was made public. As you mentioned, the situation forced that announcement, and then Penn State went back to almost immediately what the plan was, which is absolute lockdown on any of those conversations, because they've even when they've had a bowl game, Greg, they've never made these announcements. They have been made. They've only been made when they have to be made, and then afterwards they get the graphic and they get to say goodbye on social media instead of having these long public conversations about it.
I see what you did there, T. Frank. You're trying to get people wound up about the Peach Bowl not playing situations on a Wednesday morning. I see what you did there. We'll move on. We will not linger on that point, but you're absolutely right. Typically, Penn State players have waited until after the fact of the season ending to make news, and they certainly will whenever this season comes to a conclusion. I think one thing that's important to note, and I wrote this somewhere, I think over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, but these guys are in no rush to have to make these decisions either privately or publicly. Now, I'm sure privately, obviously, some of them have already been made, but from a public standpoint, they have until the middle of January to go into to declare for the NFL draft. And so, that's the conversation we're having here, of course. They have until the middle of January. If they make it to the college football playoff, they have almost to the end of January. So when you're talking about these guys who have NFL draft day or go decisions, they certainly do not need the rush to make them, do not need the rush to put something out there just because we're asking or fans are asking, whatever it might be. And so we'll hear more about those in the days ahead, depending on how long Penn State plays, which is an 8.5-point favorite, as we're going to talk about here. I'm assuming many out there are thinking they will be playing at least through the end of 2024. Anything else from this two-day media blitz, T. Frank, that caught your ear? There was a lot of quotes, a lot of conversations. We're going to get into some of those when we get more into the game discussion itself. But I know you had a chance to talk to Tom Allen. You had a chance to talk to Zane Durant. Anything in particular stand out to you to pass along?
Not really. I asked him about Zion Tracy just because I wanted to get a little bit more context about his journey to that position, in the slot, the nickel position, whatever you want to call it. Not really much to be gleaned from his answer because there's two parts of that story that I find interesting. One of them is obviously they found an answer to replace Jalen Reed at that spot with Zion Tracy, who can tackle and play. That slot role from a man coverage and a zone coverage perspective, from the coverage side of things, that's an obvious position, but he was an outside corner before. Like, they had more depth outside. And so the rise of Elliott Washington playing outside corner coincided with Zion Tracy moving inside. It just feels like all of those things were connected, and he kind of talked about those, but didn't get into any of the details. So just an interesting retrospect. The other part that I found, I guess, I don't even know how to describe it, but the conversation around big games in Ohio State and Oregon in the Big Ten championship game, there was a lot of retrospective questions for Tom Allen and Andy Kotelnicki because we haven't talked to them, in a while. That media blitz we talked about, one of the reasons that we had it is it was not there on National Signing Day like it normally is, and B, we haven't talked to them in forever. So there is this backlog of kind of cleaning things up and questions for these players and coaches that, I don't know, Greg, did you learn anything from those? Was there anything forthcoming from the perspective they gave? I'm thinking specifically of the coordinators that stood out to you. I haven't had a chance to go back and listen to any of those things, so I don't know if there's something I missed, but that would be the only thing that I'd be interested in, and I think fans would be interested in from that perspective.
Yeah, so I think the one question, and it got to Andy Kotelnicki, was about the usage of Tyler Ward in short yardage. It sort of went back to the Ohio State issues that Penn State had inside of the Buckeyes' 5-yard line in that contest, of course. And as you can imagine, a month and a half removed from that game, Andy Kotelnicki was not interested in relitigating any of that.
He did not love that.
Right.
He did not love that.
Yeah, and so that's sort of the rub of these things, is that if the questions that fans maybe are curious about or that the media is curious about, about if it's looking backward, a lot of these guys are going to just, spin it off and say, hey, we're looking ahead. We're not going back to that. So, I thought Tom Allen talking about, again, his transition from the field to the coaching booth and how that looked in hindsight to him was pretty interesting. Was hoping to get his thoughts on, and we will at some point, hopefully this postseason. And he gave him a little bit in the answer he gave you to Zion Tracy. But just, I would love to have known his immediate thought, his first thought when he heard KJ Winston, who is, of course, since declared for the NFL draft but has not played for months, had a long-term injury. I'd love to know what his initial thought was in terms of how he was going to fix that and how he was going to deal with that, and then what that ultimately ended up being from a progression standpoint throughout the remainder of 2024. Certainly it's evolved from where it was in September to where it is today. So I think, long and short of it is that we learned plenty. And I think that one thing that's become clear to me, and this is probably a halfway decent time for a transition, but we'll see if you have any final thoughts, is that listening to players from both sides this week, certainly everyone knows who each other's stars are, and they have raved about each other's stars. Penn State players about SMU, and SMU people about Penn State. So no lack of respect for this matchup between the two teams, and it's going to be a fascinating game to see unfold.
I thought it was interesting with an extra week. Everyone was a little more prepared. And because we got a chance to ask more questions this week, there were a lot more questions about SMU specifically. I was very happy that the people were asking about SMU's run game, running backs. People had watched SMU this week or last week. And so there was a lot of good questions that, specifically about the matchup that I feel like we don't always get time for, or that, people aren't asking because there's so many things to do in the week. By the time that we get to ask questions on Monday of James Franklin, we're still covering the game that just happened. That's his point, is that moving the press conference, and this is inside baseball for a lot of people, the press conference used to be on Tuesday, and he didn't want to answer questions about last week's game essentially midway through the week, so he moved the press conference to Monday. But that compresses the schedule so that we just don't have time to ask a lot of these questions and look forward the same way. So it is an interesting dichotomy of, by Tuesday, we do have the time to ask those questions. So it's almost like looking into an alternate universe, Greg, of what would it look like if there was more media availability. And it was interesting. I don't know. I still don't know if it's good or bad for Penn State fans, but it was just different and interesting.
Indeed, and that will the schedule will sort of remain that way throughout the remainder of the college football playoff, no matter how long Penn State goes. But T. Frank, I believe we should mention our advertiser sponsor for the BWI live show Wednesday, December 18th.
So Rothrock Wood Project had their open house last weekend. Unfortunately, I couldn't go. I really wanted to be there because I love this place, and they've cleaned up the second level of their shop, where it is now a full-on display area for all of their pieces that you can buy. And they got charcuterie boards, they've got end tables, coffee tables, things like that. So it was really awesome, and I'm assuming they didn't take down the decorations. So if you want to go into the shop and check them out, Rothrock Wood Project, you can go and check them out in person, or you can contact them on social media. You can give them a call. You can get the website information. And, of course, DM Scott on their Instagram page or on their Facebook page, Rothrock Wood Project. But here's the news. We talked about it this week. There's a special offer from now until Christmas. So you've got a week for this. You don't have a ton of time, but they are offering a special discount just for Blue White Illustrated fans. People who are a fan of the show. Code BLUEWHITE10 for 10% off anything from Rothrock Wood Project, including their dining tables, which are, kind of their best work that they do. The main thing that they do is make these awesome dining tables that you can own and have as like an heirloom for your family. They're that good of quality. They're priced competitively, and to get 10% off of that is a massive deal. So if you live locally, they're also offering porch drop-offs now until Christmas. So if you want to order one of these, if you want to order a charcuterie board, you can see some of the coffee tables and end tables in this picture here as well. They do all kinds of great work. I am a huge fan of what they do specifically. So this kind of thing, if you are a Penn State fan and you want to own a piece of State College, you can get it for 10% off right now. And what they do is they work with wood and epoxy. If you've never seen this, never watched the show before, they take pieces of wood from local trees downed in Center County, including State College with the borough, and they turn them into furniture. and they use epoxy with a lot of what they do, so they can make colored designs in wood, and some of them are absolutely stunning and beautiful, enhancing the colors of nature to also include blue, green, yellow, black. If you're a Steelers fan and you want a playoff bar, they can install that for you. And like I said, 10% off now until Christmas. So that's an awesome deal. We'll be talking about it over the next couple of days from now until then. So make sure you check it out, Rothrock Wood Project, on Instagram, on Facebook. You can check out them as well, rothrockwoodproject.com. Appreciate them for being a supporter of the show. Please support the people that support us. Check them out and get somebody something special for the holidays, because I would absolutely love a coffee table for Christmas.
You and me both.
Wink,
yes.
wink. Especially a really
Nicely done.
nice one.
Yes. Yep. Thank you to Rothrock. Go check them out and use that 10% off code. So getting into some questions from the chat before we get further into our rundown here. I was just looking at a couple of things here. Steven asked about, will SMU put something on Penn State like Gabriel and Tez? So this is something, T. Frank, that I may be jumping the gun here a little bit, but I think we both watched enough to kind of go off book here. That is sort of the one thing that is coming up more and more as this game gets closer, is a concern that what Oregon did to Penn State's defense with Dylan Gabriel and Tez Johnson is going to repeat itself with Kevin Jennings and either Roderick Daniels Jr. or one of the many other pass-catching options SMU has. And I think it's wise to be careful, respect what those guys can do. Know they are very talented. Yeah. Know that it's also very hard to play on the Dylan Gabriel, Tez Johnson level. And so to think it's going to be exactly like that, hard to believe. I mean, some of those throws, Dylan, there's a reason the guy was among the top contenders for the Heisman Trophy. He's terrific. Some of the throws he makes on the run are outstanding. It's a different caliber of 1-2 punch, but SMU does have some punches to throw for sure.
It's also about the run game. So, what I broke down over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com as a part of our post-game analysis, and it was a little bit rushed because we went directly from this into, preview of the bowl game, but the run game set that up. A good chunk of those plays were RPOs. So that is built off the run game, sucking defenders into the line of scrimmage and then opening up larger holes for Tez Johnson to go run into in voided zones. Penn State couldn't play man as consistently because those athletes were too good. And they couldn't play zone because when they went to the zone, the RPO started to eat them alive. They were able to counter it and get back into the game later in the third and fourth quarter, but that requires SMU to thoroughly challenge Penn State's defensive line and gash them up front. And I don't mean just pop off a couple of runs. I mean schematically make them afraid. And I don't want to say they were afraid, but they had to make some changes in that game against Oregon in order to stop the run. And they were very aggressive trying to come downhill on some of those plays. That's what made those windows so big. And then when you put an athlete like that in space who you can't, he would have been safe in a game of flag football. He would have been safe in a game of touch football. And I haven't seen that athlete over there for SMU. So yes, Jennings can extend plays. There is an opportunity for some of that to happen, but the full thing where Penn State just is like hanging on by their fingernails, that I don't see that schematically. I don't see that personnel wise either.
Well, speaking of that man and zone conversation, getting into some of what SMU coach Rhett Lashlee talked about this week, heaped praise on Tyler Warren. One of the things he said was, it was a good transition, T. Frank. He said he's a matchup problem. If you play man, he's a matchup problem. If you play zone, he's still a matchup problem because he's so big. Obviously, we've seen that play out throughout this season when teams try and stop Tyler Warren. They have not found a way to do it. I guess my question to you, based on everything what Rhett Lashlee said about Tyler Warren, is this. Having 2 weeks to prepare for Tyler Warren, does it change anything in your mind about what SMU could do to try and take him out of this game? Because to me, I have a thought on it, but curious your thoughts just based on simply extra preparation time. And I think that's something people hang on to and think that it's going to drastically change things. I'm just not sure that's the case.
Yeah, so this is kind of part of my preview that in a couple minutes when we get into like the X's and O's is there is that variable of having an extra week of practice time, and so there's something I think it could, but not for the full game. So there are things you can do to mimic other game plans you've liked and you've seen on film. You have a little bit more time to go through the film, comb through like, okay, what fits our scheme? What have they not seen recently that we could bring back and we could use against Penn State and Tyler Warren? But you still have to be who you are on defense. You still have your base defense. You still have your calls. You can't change your team's personality week to week. They are who they are on defense. So at a certain point, they'll have to play their defense. And at that point, Penn State has an advantage because Tyler Warren is everything you just said. So there is a percentage of that, but you're not going to come up with a game plan that changes your personnel's talent, essentially.
Right. SMU cornerbacks coach also saying this week, Ricky Hundley saying that one thing we've done this season is come out and execute a game plan. Now we got to do it for 4 quarters, not just a half or not just 3, which is essentially what you're getting at. SMU certainly well versed in that. A little bit more of what Rhett Lashlee talked about. One thing that I can see it in the chat, and it's been, I'm sure, in the chat for 2 weeks now, and also over at BlueIllustrated.com on the message boards on social media, is this weather conversation. So Rhett Lashlee was asked about playing in the cold at Penn State. I think we sometimes forget that it gets cold in Dallas too. Maybe not as cold, but it gets cold. I remember that Cotton Bowl that Penn State won a few years ago. It was a little chilly down there, and that was a little bit obviously later in December. But
is it 2019?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And so the final game of Micah Parsons' Penn State career, another way to get people wound up before 11 o'clock on a Wednesday. But anyway, so basically he said what you would expect him to say about the weather. It's Penn State has to play in it too. They'll do the best they can to prepare for it, blah, blah, blah. Nothing too exciting there. They're not going to, I think he said their phrasing was, it's only a concern if we make it a concern. And of course, what else would you expect him to say? So no real major insight there. If you were curious, I'm sure many considered that was probably going to be the case. But then he talked about preparing for the environment. He said they did go into their indoor facility and turn the noise up for half of practice for the defense. But he was, without directly saying it, extremely complimentary of Penn State fans and the environment they make, more or less saying you can't prepare for it. You got to get there, experience it, basically take the punch, and then figure out how to deal with it. So, that is, again, he ended that quote by saying that's why they earned home field advantage. Because one of the reasons, obviously, is that outside of the Ohio State game, that was a good factor for Penn State this season. So we'll see. But SMU saying all the right things this week. Now Penn State certainly is as well. But now, T. Frank, the talking time is soon going to be over. Yeah. And, the other obvious thing we should mention here, and this will tie into Penn State's availability and also Rhett Lashlee's, but Abdul Carter. They have said maybe the nicest things about him, SMU, that anyone has this year that's not directly associated with the Penn State program. Yes. And Abdul Carter said on Tuesday that when he found out he did not win to Bronco and Nagurski, he did push-ups until he physically couldn't do them anymore, using that as motivation. Between the clear motivation for not winning as many awards, like he said a couple weeks ago, and he was completely serious, like he thought he should have been in the Heisman Trophy conversation. And, he obviously was not in that conversation, did not win the Defensive Player of the Year awards, was the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year, but not nationally. Right. He will be ready for this game. And when you combine that with his, obviously, the natural talent and ability that he's displayed, good luck, SMU, because this guy is going to be ready to roll. Yeah. And, he was also asked about not getting holding calls. And I thought he took basically, he answered the question without saying, I'm sure, what he wanted to say. He was a very diplomatic answer. Basically, I can't get frustrated by it. I got to keep playing. But I have to think after 13 weeks so far of being held, he's probably a little bit over it and ready to see some flags fly. Like, I'm pretty sure if they do call one in the SMU game, T. Frank, he is going to celebrate wildly. I could be wrong.
I think the home crowd will do you remember, not to keep bringing things up, but I think it was Blake Gillikin when he had his first good punt at Penn State. I'd never heard a crowd cheer for a punt as much as Blake Gillikin, because if you remember, during the sanctions era, they didn't have any room to like focus on punters. So the minute they started getting special teams to not be a nightmare was a big deal. So I would imagine there might be a crowd, this Penn State fans are smart in this sense, where they might give an extra loud cheer for any holding calls called against Abdul Carter. And it's an interesting situation, because that does bleed into the Bronco Nagurski conversation about best defensive player, because if he has more sacks, he wins an award. And one of the reasons he doesn't have more sacks is because there were games where he was being clearly held. Minnesota, Oregon, late, splash plays, moments down the stretch where, yes, he's got those great highlights, but these are all stat awards. People watch the highlights, but then they look at the box numbers. And that's like, because you're asking people who cover other programs to then have a detailed and finite understanding of all these things. It's impossible. So stat award.
Yes. And a lot of them are. And that's why you heard James Franklin talk numerous times this year, mostly in the Tyler Warren conversation, but also in other realms that, he talks about football people and people who study the game closely. And he felt like, was hoping, I guess, that they would vote on certainly the Mackey Award, but others through that prism. What I would say is that, so Tyler Warren was a first team All-American by the Football Writers Association yesterday. Abdul Carter's made everyone come out so far. But the two that came out previously that had Tyler Warren on the second team were all coach votes. So I thought that was interesting in that context. But of course, as we all know, the coaches are not making those decisions. But at any rate, we got a super chat here to get to. Ryan asked my biggest fear, and thanks for the donation, Ryan. We appreciate you always being here supporting the channel. My biggest fear for Carter is that he uses speed too much and rushes past the quarterback. He's got to contain while rushing and using power. T. Frank, thoughts?
I think it's a valid fear, but I don't think it's... So when you say speed too much, I think immediately outside upfield. Abdul's actually, and this is the part of watching him and his development this year has been so impressive, because he's developed an inside move where guys who went in the first round, Chop Robinson, had essentially one move, which was speed to the outside, hands, turn the corner. And his ability to do that was first round quality. Like, that's why he went in the first round, but everyone called him underdeveloped, doesn't have a bevy of pass rush moves. Abdul Carter, in his first year at that position, has that speed to the outside. He can bend the corner. He maybe isn't as good as Chop at that, not from a physical perspective, just from, kind of the techniques, the details of how to actually bend the corner a little more efficiently. But he's also developed a more well-rounded game. He goes inside. He does use power sometimes, but he's set these things up where now he's got a 1-2 punch. Now, even when you go inside, you threaten to give up the outside. That is, I don't think it's as much a fear of he's going to just run upfield. It's that he's going to try and go for the big play instead of doing what Ryan says, which is use power to contain. And I just don't think that's Penn State's game as much. If you watch what they do, and this will be interesting to see how they play this. This is, kind of getting into the preview of the game. Do they spy? And, somebody flushes the quarterback out of the pocket, whether it's Abdul Carter or somebody else, and then there's a spy, whether it's Abdul Carter or Tony Rojas, to go track the quarterback down once he breaks the pocket. We've seen them do that. We've seen that be successful against this team, and I think that's the conversation of does he have the green light to just be aggressive, because we're going to figure that part out on the back end. That's what Tom Allen talked about as well, where he went into detail talking about what a mobile quarterback who's looking to throw the ball, that's the danger they present. It's not that they're going to break, contain, and run. It's that they're going to break, contain, and get a big play throwing the ball down the field.
Yes, and that will be key for Penn State and for Abdul Carter in this game for all the defensive linemen who will be out on the field on Saturday. Let's move into our game preview, T. Frank, and take a closer look at both sides of the ball here. Penn State is still an 8.5-point favorite in this contest. contest. The total is not budged. It's 53.5, which projects for something is in the ballpark of like 30-21 Penn State victory, give or take some rounding. But Penn State, I think most people would agree, probably have some clear edges, and SMU may have some ones they can exploit. There's also one guy on the Mustangs that is being extremely overlooked as a factor in this game, in my opinion. We'll get to him a little bit later, but let's start with the Penn State offense against the SMU defense. When you look at these two teams, Penn State comes into this game obviously off one of its better performances in the Big Ten title game from the offense's perspective this season. SMU faced Clemson in the ACC title game and, had some issues dealing with that offense, one of the better ones it faced this season. SMU comes into this game with the nation's number 28 total defense. So before we get into the real X's and O's, nuts and bolts, when you first turned on the SMU defense, what jumped out to you after, I don't know, let's call it the first half of your SMU defense review? Anything immediately come to mind?
So the problem is, like, it is X's and O's. There's two things that came to mind. First off was that the defensive line was big, and that is something I know you pointed out almost immediately. They went into the transfer portal. James Franklin talked about it. I think they have the number was 48 of their players are transfer portal.
It's 40 plus, and it's closer to 50 than 40. Yes.
Yeah, and so the D line is a big part of that. In fact, we'll get to that in just one moment of some of those transfers transferring out. But they went to SEC powers and of ACC powers, if you want to call Miami a power, and they went and they got defensive linemen that would be able to start at SMU and contribute. So that's the biggest program building mathematical equation you need to solve when you're building your team. Quarterback and the line of scrimmage, because quarterbacks are unbelievably hard. In college, there are different ways to win. So you have the ability to craft an offense around a quarterback who maybe has select skills, but isn't, a true generational passer or whatever. But you still need to find that guy that can play. And finding even a college quarterback can be pretty damn hard. The next thing is the line of scrimmage. The guys that are Penn State is still having a hard time consistently nabbing those true difference makers. Well, if you're SMU, you want guys that can play. Maybe they're not fully well-rounded, but you can craft a game plan around them. And that's what SMU did. They went and they got run stuffers. They went and got big guys that can play. And I asked Andy Cole-Nicky about this. They can do, to a certain degree, they have the personnel to go odd front or even front, depending on the team that they're facing. They've got a 350-pound nose tackle that can play one technique, nose. He can play a little bit, inside, outside. And even their top pass rusher, Elijah Roberts, is 270 pounds. Like he's closer to Denai Dennis Sutton than he is Abdul Carter in a style of play. So they have built a unit predicated on stopping the run. And then behind that, they've built a very fast, athletic defense. Drew Aller talked about their linebackers being super fast in coverage. They fly around. I don't want to call it is Big 12 adjacent in a lot of different ways. That was the feeling I got from it. It reminded me a little bit of West Virginia, not from a kind of the spirit of it as opposed to the actual X's and O's and scheme of it. But there are some trade-offs that you have with that when you're playing that style of defense, playing three safeties, playing undersized linebackers, and trying to protect them by a really big physical front, which, by the way, is what Oregon's defense is built like. That's exactly how Oregon's defense is built. They just have bigger players at the second level at that linebacker position as opposed to SMU, where their linebackers are 5'11". So, that is a factor in this game as well when it comes to Tyler Warren, Nick Singleton, and what happens if Penn State is able to break through the second level get into that secondary from a run perspective or from a catch and run perspective.
So there's two big rubs about this defense, and they're being discussed in the chat right now. So I'll just bring them up as we have this conversation. KJ Johnson, 77. So SMU does have the nation's number 4 rushing defense, but he asked, is it, what legit running game have they faced this year is the question he asked. Eric mentions the passing offense where the SMU corners are not very good. He says they are like the number 90. They're in the bottom third. Yeah, we're going to get to that in 1 second. So we're going to throw this last one up here, and then we'll get to that. But they are the bottom third of FBS in pass defense. And then Ryan notes that in terms of that run game discussion, that Clemson was held to 60, usually averages 180 a game. So it's a very interesting defense to break down, T. Frank, because I do think that to the conversation we were just having about awards, if you are looking solely at stats, you are going to say, well, Penn State should just throw it 50 times, and they will just beat up this not well-regarded statistically pass defense, and that'll be that. And if they, don't run the ball because they're really good against the run based on the numbers. So in the context of those comments in that conversation, take this whatever direction you want to go. But what do you make of what the film? I guess the obvious question here is the film versus the numbers. What differences, if any, are there?
So they're good football players and they're well coached. You can't take that away by comparing competition. Now, where would they rank in the Big Ten? How would they play against a Big Ten schedule? That is a fair question that we're going to find out. And that prognostication is just, best guess is an assumption. By starting with them and explaining where those players came from, I'm trying to set a benchmark of these are not the top of college football defensive linemen, but they're good and they're used strategically and specifically. So it will be a challenge for Penn State, but is it a challenge they can overcome? Yes. Like it is. There's a reason I feel that this should be a decisive victory for Penn State. They'll have to work for it. Is it Minnesota? Is it Oregon? Penn State found something in that Oregon game that allowed them to run against a defense that myself and former offensive lineman Landon Tangwell expect them not to be able to do anything up the middle against. So we have seen an evolution. Was that game specific to Oregon? Has SMU seen that and adjusted for that? Those are the questions of extra time off, the variables of competition level, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what I asked Andy Kotelnicki of, how are you at recycling stuff, something you just did that really worked well, versus having to iterate something new when you're facing a similar situation? And that's where I think for him specifically, a guy who is creative and is tailoring the game plan to the ideas of what he's facing and not just, ripping parts of the playbook and putting them in together in a different order, I think that's an advantage for Penn State, having that extra week. Now to the corners. Yes, they're cover 3 corners. So there's two things here. Schematically, that's the plan. And secondarily, they're probably not as good as some of the corners Penn State has seen. The part of the X's and O's that I said that kind of stuck out almost immediately was that they do a lot and it all ends up at cover 3. So what I mean is they play a defense that they can rotate safeties. They play 3 of them. They can jumble up the look of the coverage. They can have unexpected rotations, safety blitzes, a lot of extreme stuff that is not necessarily extreme. It just looks that way. But it usually ends up in the same coverage. So they can play. It's kind of it's the Andy Kotelnicki effect of it's the same stuff that looks different to make you think while they don't have to. But when you do that, and every team knows that they're going to play cover 3 and you give away that soft corner on the outside, teams are taking advantage of that. But are you ripping them a new one? Are you throwing the ball down the field in an explosive way and targeting those corners in a way that makes them wrong no matter what? Part of this is the scheme. They're designed to give you some of those short plays so you're not taking something else. That's going to be a part of the game plan because you're going to take free yards when they're there, but you do have to attack this defense. And that's where I think from a perspective of what Drew Aller is and what Andy Kotelnicki is, if you're going to end up in the same coverage, Drew Aller is going to see through it. And Andy Kotelnicki should have a plan to attack and anticipate. So when you get through the game plan, whatever they've come up with, whatever the thing is this week that they said, here's what frustrates Penn State, we're going to do this. We're going to play 10% more cover 4, or we're going to play whatever. Eventually, they're going to have to play their base defense. They're going to have to be who they are. And that's when I think Penn State should be able to throw on this defense and take advantage because Drew Aller, the processor, is not going to be fooled. There's been one game this year where UCLA got him on some coverage rotations. that's about it from what I've seen Drew Aller make mistakes where he's thrown the football to the other team, which is another part of what they're trying to do on defense, which is obscure the coverage, make you make a mistake mentally, and throw the ball to them. I don't see that as a realistic possibility for them in this game unless Drew Aller plays a very bad football game.
Yeah, the one big thing that you'll see in the predictions that we post over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com on Thursday is the conversation about turnovers. So Penn State, of course, had 2 killer ones in the Oregon game, the Big Ten title game, both off of Drew Aller's arm. But otherwise, Penn State is pretty much protected the football, not quite as well as anyone in the country, but they're obviously in that conversation. When you look at the turnover margin stats, I don't have those in front of me, but in turnover lost, I do have. And Penn State, of course, in that perspective, is sitting at number 24 in the country. With 12 losses this year, the leader is Vanderbilt with 7 for anyone that's interested. But one part of that that's interesting to me, and I'm trying to do this on the fly, is that when you look at SMU in the turnovers gain department, they ended up with 21 this season, which is... This is bad podcasting, but I had these and then I lost my notes, and 26 in the country. So certainly if Penn State plays more turnover-worthy plays, it looks like we're having some tech issues, T. Frank. I'll see what I can do to adjust for that as we continue.
Close browser tabs is the only thing that works for me on this end. So I know you're trying to get those details, but that's the risk we run having Wi-Fi.
Yes, so we'll see if we can get that fixed. But yeah, so the turnover part of the conversation certainly will, make a part of this game up. It always does. There's no question about that. So we'll see. But yeah, I look at this as, I guess, to close up the offense, Penn State offense versus the SMU defense portion of this conversation. And this is going to probably bother people too. But if you want, the slow start thing, if Penn State maybe takes a little bit of time in this game to get going, I guess it wouldn't shock me just because, again, both teams certainly had plenty of time to prepare for this. And there are some things SMU can do to the points you've made to try and slow Penn State down based on how it's operated so far this year. But I would be surprised if it's a 4-quarter slowdown. I just think I think there's just a couple edges for Penn State that will eventually become too much for the SMU defense to handle.
It just becomes to me, a lot of these shifts or pivots are what's already in our game plan, what's already in our defensive DNA that we can do that's more unexpected, that we call that a percentage more, or that we tweak something this different way. The problem is for SMU is they run, like I mentioned, they run cover 3, and they run quarters, which are 2 defenses that can complement each other from a zone perspective. But this all ends in zone. They don't have the athletes to play man coverage against the best of the best. That's the whole point of this defense. So there's 2 aspects of that are important. Pressure on the quarterback. And again, Penn State has handled power rushers better than speed. And so we saw that against Oregon, where that's what I said going into that game of they don't have elite speed rushers to challenge Penn State, and Penn State has done a good job of at best getting in the way of power rushers and not giving up immediate pressures, allowing Drew Aller to escape and extend the play. That played out. And this is another version of that. So zone, the longer you sit back there, the easier it is to find holes in said zone. So as long as Drew Aller does not rush his process, he stays calm in the pocket, zone deteriorates over time. That is a well-known football thing. And the other thing that I mentioned is if they pivot to a different coverage, the most comfortable one is cover 4 or quarters. Andy Kotelnicki has shredded cover 4 this year. Like, it is not something you should call against Penn State. Oregon did it, and they were able to get a touchdown. So that's also in the playbook. This is not a good matchup defensively on the back end for SMU from those perspectives, because the thing that has frustrated Penn State the most is pressure and game pressure plus man coverage. And those things don't set the table at home with a defense that doesn't present those problems.
So Penn State will try and obviously get going quickly against this SMU defense. We'll see. Thanks again for the heads up on the tech issues to those of you in the comments. If there's more, please always let us know, because what you're viewing and what we're seeing on the back end are not always the same thing. And there's not really any good way for us to know that. So please always let us know. I appreciate it. You ready to flip over to the SMU offense against the Penn State defense?
Absolutely.
All right. So Yeah, SMU comes into this game with Kevin Jennings, the quarterback who took over for Preston Stone in mid-September, rather, after a loss to BYU for the Mustangs. 18-15 was the final. Then Kevin Jennings has been very good since then. They have a running back, Rashard Smith, who is one of the top guys statistically in a number of categories, and I believe earned, certainly was an All-ACC pick. I'm imagining he may have ended up on somebody's All-American team. I don't have that in front of me at the moment, but certainly plenty of options then in the pass game too, in terms of the number of guys who have caught touchdowns and just caught passes, period. So it's a very interesting offense for Penn State's defense to deal with. I guess let me just start with this, because it's going to be the question I think that Penn State fans, well, one of them anyway, but it's one I've seen a lot. As you look over the Penn State games so far, are you happy enough with the way Penn State has solved its prior communication issues on defense at this point of the season? Before we even get into the SMU part of it, just from a Penn State perspective, that is something that seems to come up often. Does it come up more than it should now compared to, obviously, earlier in the year, everyone in and out of the program admitted it was a pretty big problem?
Yeah, yes and no. It crops up is the problem. So there are two: general communication of getting the call in. For the most part, yes. Like, they've solved the systematic problems that they had against Bowling Green specifically that led to massive breakdowns in coverage. The issue was against Oregon. What Oregon did is they used tempo, and Penn State's process was not fast enough to match that tempo. They were able to adjust on the fly. And again, the damage was done. So you can't give them credit for like, oh man, they played great in that game. But they did stop the bleeding to a certain perspective. They were able to adjust and fight back, and it wasn't a complete steamrolling. Because you've seen at times in games with other defenses and other programs, once you get on your heels, you don't get off that spot, because then the offense can pivot and attack you in a different way. Penn State did challenge Oregon, especially in the run, to stop some of these situations, set up 3rd and long. But they did. Devon J. Thomas talked about this, where, he said, what's the thing you learned from the Oregon game? He said, just have your cleats in the ground. Obviously, they exposed something, that other teams are going to try with tempo, but I think that we've fixed those problems. So they're aware of it. And yes, I think communication can be an issue, but some of the other times it's cropped up, it's because depth players were in the game, thinking against Purdue, right? So defensive communication between players, I think, has been generally good. And the only other area where I think they do have trouble sometimes is in bunch formations. And still, if they're going to switch, are they on the same page of who's got who, inside, outside release, or stick with your man? All those situations, they don't have those communication things buttoned up 100%, but they have gotten better. Only really good teams have really frustrated them from how to attack them with those bunch formations. And it did get them against Oregon early in the game.
No doubt about that. Excuse me. KJ points out that he feels like he's frustrated by the communication pre-snap with the defense, frustrating to watch, he says. I think it goes without saying, a part of that has to be the fact that Tom Allen's relaying the call to Dan Connor, who's relaying it to whoever the green dot is, Kobe King or whoever's on the field at that point. There's an obvious lag time there, but they figured that's the best system for them. So I get it's frustrating to watch for fans. There's no doubt about that, but I don't think they're going to change that communication process at this point in the season, so they just have to deal with it the best they can. But when you look at this SMU offense, T. Frank, like I said, a lot of very interesting pieces on it. When you first took a look at the group, what stood out to you, maybe what you thought you were going to see versus what you saw?
Yeah, and I talked about this yesterday with Fitz, and I have not had a chance to go and do more film study because of a bunch of other things going on. But the receivers, I was under the impression that they had really good dynamic receivers. And so when I watched the Clemson game, and then I went and I watched a couple of other games, I'm not saying they're bad by any means, but I didn't see dramatic separation or the ability to get open irrespective of the coverage, alignment, type of coverage, etc. So they're good football players. They can challenge in a lot of different ways. But when James Franklin says Jennings, the quarterback, makes them go, that's also part of what he's saying is when Jennings is on and he's throwing really good passes into tight windows, and those guys are coming down with it because they're generally pretty good contested catch and they're pretty good hands. that's when they have success. But if you can frustrate the quarterback, nobody is so dangerous that it breaks your coverage no matter what. Like, that's what we were saying earlier. There's no Tez Johnson over there that is, you are going to alter what you do if you're Penn State based on the talent of the player across from you.
And so I think that's one very interesting thing to note when looking at this SMU offense. The other thing is that they have played some good defenses, not a ton of them. And certainly they're going to see a very good one on Saturday at Penn State. So, I guess that's a big question is, and the other, well, I guess the other one is, well, number one, let me just gather my thoughts here as I ramble. Hopefully maybe that's a part of the tech issues too. Number one, Smith is their rushing attack for the most part. And if it's not him, it's Jennings. And then there's not another running back that's really used in this offense. Who's
the guy that you said was super overrated in this game? Is it Smith, the running back? Is it somebody else?
Underrated, I said. Underrated.
Yeah,
sorry. Yeah. Underrated. No, we'll get to that next. That's when we talk special teams. Yes.
Oh, good. Oh, yeah. I haven't looked at that at all.
Yeah, so we'll get to that. No, Smith is certainly not overrated, but it is interesting that when you look at those carry statistics, I mean, it is all him. They lean on him big time. And then it's Jennings, and then it's Daniels, who is the third ball carrier for them in terms of number of attempts. So interesting fact there. Obviously, Penn State has split the wealth, so to speak, over the years with Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. That is not the case for SMU. But just Jennings in general, and you've talked about this a little bit throughout the first 50 minutes of the show, but what do you see in him when he's running? Like when he's on the move, he can obviously move the pocket. I'm not talking about on the run as in I'm running for a first down. I mean on the move as in I have to make a throw and I'm not necessarily in position to set my feet and do it. What kind of passer is he in that regard?
He's great. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of what happened in the first half of that game against Clemson. There's a couple of things that I think are important specifically for that game, which is what a lot of people probably were watching and the reference of. Drops were an issue in that game. He was on, but there were a lot of drops in the first half that kind of built that deficit. But also, that's what they need to do because the offensive line is pretty good. But if you're talking about the way they built the defensive line, I don't think they necessarily succeeded on the offensive line. It's a harder position. It's a harder position because you got to be good at everything. And that is where, if you look at the Clemson game, they're doing end arounds, jet sweeps, they're moving the pocket, he's flush from the pocket. It was all built on these things that are precarious. They're hard to do. And so when those variables go against you, then you get down big, especially if your defense isn't able to contain whatever's happening on the other side of the line of scrimmage. But once they get hot, if they get going, it can also add in. And Eric has a question here in the chat that I think is really important to the structure of this offense as well. Yeah. So he's good on the run. He's good throwing. He's accurate, I think, at all times. Like, I think generally you call him a very accurate quarterback. The nature of the offense is hard for me because they throw the ball primarily underneath. Like the screen, I come away from games feeling like this is a small ball offense, right? Short passes, screens. If he were in the Big Ten, he would be one of the top quarterbacks in throws under 10 yards. Anything under 10 yards or behind the line of scrimmage. But Jennings will throw the ball up. So I think that balances the offense out generally, where if he were not there, this would be a dink and dunk offense that is less successful. But he's willing to put the ball up into those contested catch situations that we've talked about, putting it into some tight windows. Overall, it has not gotten him into trouble because he's accurate. But when things don't go well, it's because he's throwing turnovers. You can force those from him, but it is difficult, and only a couple of teams have done it. One of them was Manny Diaz. So, we've seen a real life comparison of a similar team doing interesting things. As always, it's a pleasure to watch Manny Diaz craft a game plan and do something that you weren't expecting. And I got to see some old friends, like a double corner blitz turning into cover two. Like, it was great. And he did a lot of really smart things that I think Penn State shouldn't rip one for one because they've had a whole season to correct those mistakes. But you can take the spirit of those things and apply them to this game to force Jennings into mistakes.
Right. And I think that the Manny Diaz connection is one I'm not going to overplay here, but it is interesting. Rhett Lashlee, very good friends with him, the SMU head coach, said he watched more Penn State last year than this year when he had time just because he's very good friends with Manny Diaz, who of course was on Penn State staff last year. So an interesting sort of, I can only imagine his phone's been ringing a lot lately.
Yeah, Manny Diaz, for those that don't know, Manny Diaz was the head coach at Miami, and Rhett Lashlee was his offensive coordinator. So there's a ton of overlap, and that's why they're friends, and all of those connections are relevant to this game. Like they're very relevant to this game. I know Andy Kotelnicki is a different person. Tom Allen's a different person, but the structure, a lot of those defensive structures are left in place. A lot of those concepts are similar because that's why they hired Tom Allen.
Right. And then obviously we'll see some of those things that Manny Diaz left behind that Penn State kept, and certainly the things that Allen have implemented as well this weekend when Penn State hosts SMU on Saturday. Before we get into the last segment of the show, T. Frank, any just final thoughts on this SMU offense versus Penn State defense matchup?
It's a little bit overdone, but it is true. How Penn State plays the run will dictate this game. I've seen this offensive line block well, and the running back does a lot to make them look good. He is a really good runner that sets up people well in the hole, has that lateral ability to press the hole, cut, and get outside, or to bounce into a new gap. They're almost all inside zone. So it plays into Penn State's strengths. I don't know that they're going to have a lot of success. And Zane Durant, Devon J. Thomas, if they had Alonzo Ford, it would be a runaway, victory for Penn State between the tackles. It's already a strong victory. But containing the runner from bouncing out and being gap discipline across the board is the key to this game. And so rinse and repeat. Kobe King, Tony Rojas have to have good games. Dom DeLuca has to have a good game. The slot corner, because again, they play almost all spread. You're probably going to see two linebackers. I don't know that you'll see a lot of 12 personnel out there for SMU, so that means you're going to see a lot of Zion Tracy. That's why I asked about him. He's going to be very important in this game in terms of run defense and pass coverage. At least that's my anticipation. So if you stop that, this offensive line cannot contain Abdul Carter, Dennis Sutton, and the pass rush. I just don't see the offensive line being an advantage for them, and therefore that, to me, puts SMU on their heels. They're going to have to do some stuff to make this work, and it's going to be more than they had to do against Clemson, in my opinion, in terms of trying to get creative with the offensive game plan to get guys out in space and take advantage of Penn State's aggressiveness.
Penn State SMU, a lot more discussion coming over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com about this first-round college playoff matchup. We have just a few minutes left here on today's BWI Live show, though. Wednesday, December 18th. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. T. Frank, it's portal time. Yeah. It is transfer portal time. So Sean Fitz, Ryan Snyder, guys over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com have been heavily reporting on the transfer portal, Penn State's efforts, both incoming and outgoing, since the portal opened back on December 9th. As we sit here at 10:56 a.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, December 18, the only addition is former USC receiver Kyron Hudson. The three departures all are well known, by Penn State fans at this moment. Bo Prapula, T.A. Cunningham, and Jerry Cross. As of this second in time, none of those three have found a new home. But yes, as we get ready to wrap up the show here, T. Frank, Sean Fitz does have a new prediction in for Penn State to land a transfer portal player. You'll have to head over to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com for that, where you can try us out for just $1 for 7 days of access. That'll get you not just through the college football playoff first-round matchup between Penn State and SMU, but also the aftermath of it, any portal things that happen after that, any recruiting news, coaching staff changes, what have you. Try us out over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Just $1 for 7 days of access.
Great virtual stocking stuffer. Even if you don't want to go, even if you want to skip that and go all in on a yearly subscription, I think that you could not find a better value for a Penn State football fan in your life than to subscribe to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com and get our insider information from people who are so well connected, it makes me dizzy. Like I do all of my work from the outside of looking at the film and trying to be like, okay, here's what the lay of the land is. But from the football perspective, but if you want to know what's going on inside the building, go inside BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. That's where the answers are.
$1 for 7 days. Check us out, BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. I forgot about this. I got to go backwards real quick. The underrated guy on SMU. I've been talking about it for almost an hour.
I was going to save it for the last of the show. I was going to save it for the very end, but go for it.
It's the kicker, Colin Rogers. He's the first team All-American. You're going to look at his numbers and say, yeah, I don't know about that. He's only 23 of 31, but he has 7 50-plus yard field goals this season, which is impressive. So a guy that no one's talking about, and I know it's going to be windy and not a great day for kicking, presumably at Beaver Stadium, but just keep an eye on that guy. SMU might find itself in some more advantage, if it needs to, of course, kicking situations than anticipated. But back to the portal, T. Frank. Obviously, it's been building up all show long. USC, Zachariah Branch, his brother, is a safety. Zachariah Branch is a receiver, both from USC in the transfer portal. Zachariah Branch went in with a do not contact tag, which means he probably knows where he's going. And certainly, we'll see if that ends up somehow being Penn State. I would highly doubt it, but time will tell. But all told, just an interesting, portal discussion to be had about the receiver position at large, because it is not totally money-driven position, but heavily money-driven position in a lot of cases. And when you're talking about the guys at the top of the list, I believe On3's Pete Nakos and Steve Wiltfong put that the former Georgia Tech receiver Nick Singleton is going to stick in the SEC. Their pick was Auburn, I believe. So clearly there's money to be had out there for top receivers in the transfer portal. And it's a crowded marketplace to compete in. There's no question about that.
Yeah, and literally a couple minutes ago, I think, Zachariah Branch, here are the schools that On3 has said he's involved with: Miami, Michigan, Florida, Oklahoma, Georgia, Louisville. I don't know how Michigan fits into the aggressive, not aggressive conversation with NIL anymore, because they've obviously made some big splashes in NIL, but generally you look at some of those schools and Miami sticks out as and Florida, any Florida school in general, you have to assume is at least somewhat aggressive with NIL. So I think it's interesting for a guy who's underperformed, and Zachariah Branch has obvious NFL talent. Are you looking for a bag, or are you looking to get better? And I think that those two things are not completely linked. Now, you can go and be productive in other places, but Miami, what's their situation at quarterback? What's Michigan's situation at quarterback next year? Are they going to get a quarterback? I think those are related. And for Penn State, like, you have the quarterback situation and that's set in stone, but are they? This is why Eric Rivers, I think, is important. And you mentioned that he's going to go to Auburn, and reportedly the command was $1 million or more in the portal for Nick Singleton. So is Penn State in on Zachariah Branch? And are they in on the price for what might be seen as a number one receiver in the portal? Because remember, Penn State is not looking for just another guy in the portal at this point. They need to target somebody who can be a difference maker if possible. So is Branch going to be a number one receiver to them? And what's the price tag? So those, I think, are the valuable things. But as you pointed out, he likely already has his destination in mind, or he has some idea of the schools that have already been in contact. And Penn State, if they didn't have a prior relationship, it's not going to be part of the conversation, it seems.
So time will tell on that. One other note here before we get out of here: Bo Prabula, of course, is in the transfer portal. Former Penn State quarterback. On3 reporting UCF, Iowa, and Missouri are the early schools to watch for the former Nittany Lion Pennsylvania native. So we'll see how that all plays out. Very interested to see where he ends up. Obviously, a lot of Penn State fans are too. UCF, Iowa, Missouri, the early teams to watch. But as we all know, T. Frank, these lists can change and evolve pretty quickly, especially at quarterback, where guys are constantly, in, out, going here, going there, changing their mind, so on and so forth. So those premium positions, certainly things tend to happen fast. And they're going to happen fast, and we'll have you covered with all of it at bluewhiteillustrated.com. Final thoughts, T. Frank?
I just think that those destinations are super interesting. Missouri is competitive with Penn State for several quarterbacks, or generally football players, including the quarterback in Matt Zollers. If the bridge to Matt Zollers is Bo Prabula, I find that super interesting. And then if it goes to Iowa, Iowa's on the schedule next year, so you'll have the Bo Prabula revenge game with the Iowa Hawkeyes. That's just interesting. Like, I find those teams interesting. Who was the third one on the list there? UCF. Less interesting, but still. I think that's just generally a fascinating list of places. And also, it goes to say two things. Prabula, Big Ten and Power 5 starting quarterback. There's no question about that. Was he better than Drew Aller at any point in his Penn State career? We can have those conversations in retrospect, but the end result was probably not. And decisively not. He never started over Drew Aller. And then the third part is just like the projection forward of where he might land. I think that those are all some interesting topics and conversations that I wanted to make sure we got to here at the end of the show.
Head over to bluewhiteillustrated.com for the latest on Penn State, SMU, and the transfer portal. It's $1 for 7 days of access. Try us out today over at bluewhiteillustrated.com. A couple table setters to note here. Penn State will practice tonight. The guys will be out there, and we'll have full report over at bluewhiteillustrated.com. James Franklin then holds his final news conference of SMU week. You can find the video of that right here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel. And then it's on to the Thursday recruiting show with Sean Fitz, T. Frank, and Ryan Snyder, which obviously will be, I'm sure, transfer portal heavy.
Oh, yeah.
And it'll be game day, T. Frank. And it's coming before we know it.
Terrified. It's going to be cold. We're going to be outside again, outside the Bryce Jordan Center for the tailgate show. Come join us. Bring me heat warmers, to keep me alive, please. I'm wearing snow pants. I'm abandoning all fashion and or professionalness for on air just so that I can speak without physically shivering on air. We're going all in on it's winter and I'm wearing snow pants.
It is, and it's time for more football. Penn State SMU coming up on Saturday. We'll have you covered at bluewhiteillustrated.com. That is Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. Thanks for joining us. Check back in Thursday. Check back in Wednesday night. Don't forget, $1 for 7 days of access at bluewhiteillustrated.com. We'll catch you next time. It's BWI Live.